Now this is the outside of the reading room, the O'Connor reading room of Herring Hall, the business school that will soon become English and linguistics. And it was going to be in this reading room. But again they thought, oh, too many books. So they moved all the books, moved all the shelves. They said, this room is too long. This room is too long by 8 or 10 feet. So they built a wall that's looking toward where you come in. And they're going to build a wall from the floor all the way to the top in that vaulted ceiling. And they're going to paint it and so forth. And then they're going to put a beautiful kind of backlit blue map. And that's just because that they thought, see, they put the new wall in, they just thought aesthetically, given the length of the table, this table weighed 4,500 pounds, cost $175,000. And they thought that the room was a little bit too long for that table. So they built a new wall. And they painted it and so forth and fixed it up. And see, added that backlit map, and then all the books are gone. Now this table was a really handsome table. It weighed 7,000 pounds. It took 2,300 man-hours to build. The middle of it is curly maple from a tree cut in Michigan in 1962 that Ray Brockstein's office had just kept that log for 28 years waiting for kind of a special project. And so here was a special project. And the outside of it was a kind of cherry from a 100-year-old tree cut in Pennsylvania. $175,000 for this table. It had places you could plug in, you could get all the languages translated and so forth. Remember a few years ago when there was an economic summit in Clinton's administration in Denver, and I heard Rush Limbaugh on the radio. I don't just listen to Rush, but I happened to hear this. And he was complaining about Democratic extravagance. And they spent, can you believe it, he said, $35,000 on an economic summit table. And I thought, oh, you packers, I mean, we spent on 4 tables about $500,000, and this one alone, $175,000. Now, after this was over with, this table was given to the State Department. And Kathy Collins has recently tracked down what happened to that table. It was a beautiful table, and for some reason the State Department decided they didn't need it, so they put it in storage in a kind of a naval warehouse on a military base. And a storm came and blew down the building, and it crushed the table. And so the table was just, when they cleaned up the building, they just destroyed it and carted it away. So that table never saw any use after it left Houston. The table that was in the Founders Room that was used for about an hour and 45 minutes Monday, Rice purchased, and that is the boardroom table. So if you ever go into an event in the Founders Room, that really nice table was the table. The other 2 tables, the 2 round tables, one went to A&M, one went to the Brown Foundation. I mean, they didn't go to them, they bought them. So this is where they're going to meet for Tuesday, and for a couple of hours Monday morning. Now, a big issue is security. You're going to have heads of delegation and foreign ministers and so forth from all over the world. And this has got to be a very safe place. And one of the advantages of the Rice campus that they spelled out to the White House was that the Rice campus is like a 300-acre oasis, that you could isolate it. And so for the whole duration, this was you were not allowed to take photographs here, so this is a surreptitiously taken photograph from a car driving by. I don't remember who took it and answered me, but one of us broke the law in doing this. And they had these, they made one-way traffic around the Rice campus. They put these barrels up, and every 100 feet they had a policeman standing there 24 hours a day around the clock. And they trimmed the trees and put in extra lighting so that it would not be dark. And they sprayed especially for mosquitoes and so forth. And they had people who brought coffee and whatever every hour. So the whole campus is surrounded by this corridor of armed policemen. And then if you could have gotten past them, there was electronic surveillance inside them. And then as you got closer to the buildings, it was almost wall to wall. They could almost touch each other, Secret Service and other government people with dogs armed marching around. I was talking to the security person about some of the security. And I said, well, what if, just imagine, I was thinking of Francis Lowenheim. I said, what if you had some professor who's kind of, not keeping up with things and been away and just sort of comes back on campus and walks on campus? What would happen? And the woman said, well, I'm not allowed to tell you what would happen. She said, but I'll say this. Imagine a bullseye painted on your chest. They did bomb searches several times of all the offices in everybody's office. You checked every door to make sure you didn't have bombs or whatever. And they did 2 or 3 checks of all the tunnel system at Rice. And then once they were satisfied themselves that the tunnels were okay, they welded shut all the manhole covers. And those little pieces of white are to show where the manhole covers are welded. You can imagine a terrorist popping up with a machine gun. So they took care of that. They also removed from all around the Rice campus and all the routes that heads of delegations would use in coming from their hotels to the campus. They removed all the the mailboxes, so that no one could, place a bomb in a mailbox and then detonate it as the car went by. And they also had big government-looking vehicles with dark windows with cameras. And they drove up and down all the streets right around the Rice campus. And they drove several times the routes the head delegation would take, filming all the license plates. Then they did computer checks of all the license plates to see if there were any unusual cars there or any car owned by anybody who'd ever made a threat against the White House and so forth. They also did other kinds of electronic surveillance of the Rice campus for a week or so that I can't tell you about. But if something untoward would have happened and it had originated in any way on the Rice campus, they would have known. They also had on top of the building, this is on top of the physics building, security personnel with binoculars and high-powered rifles. On top of the physics building, on top of the library, on the buildings in the medical center, looking at the Rice campus. This was a dead airplane space for 6 miles. No airplanes could fly over. They had big Black Hawk helicopters that were stationed at Ellington that when the head delegation were here were hovering off several miles away. And they practiced swooping in at really high speed and swooping in and touching down right outside the business school between Hearing Hall and the RMC. In case there was a terrorist attack, the Black Hawk helicopters could come in. The heads of the delegation were instructed with the people there to run out and get in the Black Hawk helicopters, and you'd be whisked off. I should back up. I'm not talking about this right now. They also realized that you've got all these people here. What if someone gets sick? So they did a medical history report of every head delegation so that they knew if anybody had any susceptibility to gout or to ulcers or to anything. They had 4 or 5 complete operating rooms, completely staffed, held on standby. And they had ambulances on campus and fire trucks on campus, and in the various parade routes there were 2 ambulances, and one in case the first one had a flat or something, and then they had on standby experts in every disease or every ailment that any of the visiting delegates had ever been known to have, so that in case anyone got sick just like that, they knew they had someone ready to take care of them. In all the official meetings, every nation had a closed-circuit TV with no audio, just picture. And each head of delegation had his own personal physician. And there was a television, live television, again with no audio, on the face of every head of delegate. And so the entire meeting, the personal physician is sitting in front of the TV watching the face of his head of state. So if his head of delegation had a stroke or in any way seemed to be even momentarily out of it, that doctor could instantly notify the relevant officials. Also, you think about it, all these various nations for 2 or 3 days, their nations are being governed here in Houston. So there was some disputing and fighting of who got which hotel. The Japanese, for example, really wanted in on the park. But a Canadian company owned it, so Canada got that. But I mean, they all, the Japanese ended up with a Marriott there in the Galleria. But the various delegations got various hotels. Of course, they did very intensive security checks on the hotels, all their workers. That people do food tests to make sure there was no poison or ground glass in any of the food. And then they put in very, very sophisticated communication equipment in each of the hotels so that every head of delegation could be in instantaneous communication with his nation in case something happened. Also, this is a free nation. And so they realized that there would be protesters. And particularly some of the delegations, I remember one of the French ones said to me, I can't believe that y'all let these protesters come. But, this is a free nation. So we said, well, in Herman Park, people can protest. But, you have to stay in Herman Park, and we're going to be watching you, but you can protest. And, sure enough, there was a KKK protest. But they were very closely supervised. And in fact, if you look at their parade, there are more police marching behind the KKK. I mean, the KKK protested, but it was a fairly muted protest. Okay, then they realized whether this is going to be a televised event. Rice is becoming a movie set for the world. And I want to emphasize, it really is a choreographed event. And so they put in very extensive telephone, fiber optic, and television cables. Southwest Bell had 2,000 people working for months on this. The Southwest Bell man told me he thought that their investment in this was $50 million in the communication infrastructure. And they put in super high-quality fiber optic from the campus under a tunnel under to Main Street. And then part of them went downtown to the Brown Convention Center, where most of the journalists would be. And then another one out South Main to where there was a satellite uplink station, so they could satellite uplink and televise this worldwide. And so they put in a huge amount of fiber optic all over the campus, removed the old copper fiber optic between the various buildings, and particularly the student center where the Secret Service stayed, and put in a really $1.5 million fiber optic, which they just ended up giving to Rice because it would cost them more to take it out than it would to just leave it there. And they also had to put in all kinds of special electricity, so for all these television trucks. So they put in special generators to make special electricity or additional electricity for Lovett Hall and so forth. Most electricity from this part of the Rice campus comes from two 12,470 volt lines that goes to a power plant. If you go downtown on top of the freeway kind of splits and there's a kind of a bunch of electrical stuff taken up. Well, that's where the stuff comes from. So they had security watching that totally so that no one could blow out the electricity. And they had two different lines coming in. And there's a separate line that comes in down Greenbrier to feed into the stadium. And they put in a special linkage from there to the student center so that no matter what happens, Secret Service would have electronic communication. I mean, you begin to think about all this infrastructure. This is a costly little event. And out in front, they had this, just everywhere you look, television trucks and cameras and so forth. Now, most of the journalists are actually going to stay down at the Brown Convention Center. And there will be only tiny numbers of sort of pool journalists who actually come to the Rice campus on very specified moments. And these specified moments are so-called photo opportunities. Most of the journalists never get to the campus. Some of them come before the Rice Summit and they're shown around. There's kind of a hospitality suite in the R room. And they were given all kinds of brochures about Rice. But when the summit comes, this is a closed event. So about something like 1,500 actual acting journalists, plus photographers and soundmen and so forth, are down at the Brown Convention Center. And that was a kind of a fun place to be because they had around the clock wonderful food set up, kind of Oriental food and Texas food and Mexican food that various restaurants gave people to eat. And they had all kinds of free gimmies and that kind of stuff. And various places in Houston had information desks. And Rice had a really handsome information desk where we handed out booklets and posters and films and so forth on Rice. And funny, the journalists were really competing for Rice caps and so forth. They began, I'll give you a CBS cap for a Rice cap. And it was kind of a brisk trade in that. And one of the fun things about being down there at this, I love that Brown Convention Center because, first of all, she had free breakfast and free lunch and free dinner. But one of the nicest things was that Brown and Root set up a kind of a newspaper cafeteria so that they air-shipped in every morning newspapers from around the world. So that, for example, a journalist, the London Times journalist or Figaro or whatever, could file a story, let's say, Monday evening. And the Tuesday morning London Times would be there free at this kind of big newspaper rack. And so you could just go down there and go get a great breakfast and sit and have coffee and just kind of look at free newspapers. I mean, this was nice. the editors of the Thresher had an idea. All these hotshot journalists around the world, we ought to have student journalists, and George Rupp liked the idea. So they invited student journalists, college newspapers, from each of the participating countries, Germany and Italy and so forth. Plus they picked sort of 10 representative colleges in the United States. And Rice paid the airfare and the food and everything for all these student journalists to come for a week, to go to all the events just like regular journalists, and then publish special issues of the Thresher all the way through. And I have to say, being down at the Brown Convention Center and seeing the journalists, that the journalists were actually more interested in the Rice Thresher special issues done by international students than they were reading their own papers. Here they just, the amount of equipment was just sort of amazing. And then they built out a big reviewing stand just this side of the Willie statue. Not just perfect television distance away from that little reviewing stand. And of course, this was not air conditioned, didn't have a roof. This was just a working journalist. And they put in places to plug in their cameras and plug in their audio equipment and so forth. And it was 4 or 5 levels like that, about 80 feet long. And there was a smaller stand like that just north of Sewell where the journalists would be. So when the heads of state all marched out for that 8-minute ceremony, they would be there having waited in the sun a couple of hours. They could then get perfect television shots. This is down the Brown Convention Center. And that's the little Rice University booth, and we had Macintoshes with CD stuff about Rice campus and all kinds of information to hand out and pictures of Rice campus. And there were alums, you see Franz Bronson and so forth, other people you recognize there. They were down there wearing Rice T-shirts to answer questions, and we had faculty who spoke Italian, who spoke German, who spoke Spanish, who spoke Japanese. So if there's a journalist there who needed another language than English, we had a faculty person there to talk to him. And this was at the kind of visitor center out at the R room where the people could come out and, we talked about Rice and look at the campus and so forth. And for months in advance of the summit, various heads of state or their people would come to the campus to sort of check out where it was going to be. And most of those occasions, George Rupp would meet them and sort of welcome them and say, you can look at the campus and so forth, and they would take them around. There you see a whole delegate, that's Fred Mallett there on the right, and a group of Japanese people who've come in to sort of check out the campus. The Japanese had more journalists than anyone else. And in fact, they wanted to be able to broadcast live back to Japan from Rice. But at the proper time, it's midnight here. So Rice put in incredible lighting and lit the front of Lovett Hall so it looked like daylight. So it looked beautiful, but that way you could have a journalist out there like at 2 o'clock in the morning broadcasting live to Japan, and Lovett Hall looked just like daytime behind you. Now, these are choreographed events. So when the event really comes and the heads of state are going to show up, you've got to have it all timed. And so, of course, they fly down the 8,000-pound limousine, and there were some concerns about this because the White House said they needed to smooth out the roads. First place, they knew that on Tuesday the heads of delegation were going to be in the business school, Herring Hall, and they were going to walk down to the faculty club to have lunch. Actually, it's too far to walk, so a bus would meet them at the Herring Hall, and a bus would bring them down about 300 feet, and then the bus would stop, and they get out of the bus, and then the bus would be moved. And then they would walk the final 200 feet under those arches there by, kind of between Baker College and Sewell Hall and so forth. And they'd kind of walk, and that would be a photo opportunity when they were walking under the trees. So the White House said, move the speed bumps, because the speed bumps, they had speed bumps. It causes shadows. And for goodness sake, move all those signs that say, watch out for pedestrians and so forth. And of course, so they moved everything. And then they said, well, the road is not, it's not fresh enough. So Rice repaved, re-asphalted the road, so it would look really nice and black and no speed bumps and so forth. And then it was really hot, and they hadn't realized how long it takes in hot weather for asphalt to set up. And they began to panic with this 8,000-pound limousine. Would it leave ruts? And if it left ruts, what would that do for the shadows? And so they out here at night with sprinkling cool water and special devices kind of trying to press and get the road to clear up. Then they had students. They had a woman, for example, who would act as though she were Margaret Thatcher. And they would open the door and see how long it took Margaret Thatcher to walk from here to there. So everything is timed to the second. Everything is choreographed. Every moment, every person was told where to stand, which way to look, when to take pictures. It was a movie set. Now, finally, I'm running out of time. It's amazing. It takes so much. The people started coming. Kai-Fu from Japan came earliest on Friday. The event's going to begin Monday. And others begin to sort of draggle in. That's not a very highfalutin word, but they began sort of coming in, you know. Actually, Andretti from Italy and Helmut Kohl and Mitterrand are going to come the very last day because their nations are involved in the World Cup. And actually, Germany wins the World Cup, and it's actually in Rome, and it's against France. And so Helmut Kohl is not about to leave until the game is won, and Andretti, as the host, can't leave, and Mitterrand. So those guys end up going to be coming in like Monday morning. But because, you know, they hadn't, their nations ended up being in the World Cup. Anyway, so when they, and so a lot of people in Houston say, well, when all these hot shots get here, we ought to show them the symphony and the museums and, you know, high culture. And the White House said, you know, the guys from Paris and London and so forth, they've actually seen museums and paintings and whatever. And so we ought to show them, George Bush says, let's show them Texas. So everybody in Houston was sort of dismayed, but George set up a deal in the rodeo. And he got, for the first time ever, Minnie Pearl and Loretta Lynn and Bill Monroe. They all came down, and they put on a kind of a shortened version of the Grand Ole Opry and the Grand Ole Opry and the rodeo. And they had bull riders and fancy ropers and so forth. And they capped it off with a barbecue. In case you ever want to cater, this is what was. They had 7,200 pounds of brisket and sausage, 3,000 pounds of potato salad, coleslaw, and baked beans, 165 gallons of barbecue sauce, 500 pounds of sliced onion, 650 gallons of iced tea and lemonade, 5,000 slices of carrot cake and cherry cobbler. And in deference to the uninitiated taste buds of the visitors, only 84 gallons of jalapeno peppers. But that was, and then the absolute climax of this rodeo event, they rolled out this cowboy boot that was about the size of a small truck. And it was a real fancy cowboy boot. And everybody's not really knowing what was happening, you know. And then at the last minute, the back of the cowboy boot fell down like that, like a ramp. And an attractive young woman on a horse, dressed in red, white, and blue with a cowboy hat, waving an American flag, trotted out of the, I mean, just exactly the kind of image that Texans like to, and one of the best pictures in this book is a picture of some rodeo expert giving George Bush instructions on how to do rope tricks, you know. And there's a picture behind it of Margaret Thatcher. And the look on her face is just of utter incredulity. You know? I mean, we really, Jeff Cox, he and I designed this book. We wanted to put that picture in there because Margaret Thatcher's, the look on her face just says it all. Anyway.